I was born in Brooklyn in 1961 to a couple of mixed Sephardic lineage. My mother is of Syrian lineage, my father is of Iraqi lineage. My father left the home when I was very, very young, and I was raised by my mother.
My name in Arabic is Hikmat Nassim Rabia, and my name in Hebrew is David Rabi, which was changed recently to Rabia. I was born in Baghdad, Iraq, in the year 1938. I completed my BA in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in Literature and History, MA in Semitic Languages, and PhD in Arabic from Druz University in Philadelphia.
Well, I think it was a surprise to me that people did not realize that there was such a thing as Arab Jews. I'm not sure how many people within the context held on to that identity. I think very few, you know. But in reality, we knew very little about the Jewish world that existed here, and they knew very little about us. Of course, we came here, so we know a lot about them now, and I think they still know very little about us.
The culture breaks down into different elements. The most important element is really the literary philosophical element. And one of the things that we have tried to do is inculcate some memory of Spain and the Middle East, particularly in the early Middle Ages. The years we're talking about basically from the 9th century about the 12th century. And many things in that period, such as the work of Moses Maimonides, the work of Saadia Gaon, the work of Judah Halevi. These individuals wrote very, very important texts, and these texts, which are known but not known, studied and not studied, are part of a larger mosaic of that culture. And that's where the culture really intersects with Arab culture, because all three of those writers wrote their major works, their major literary works in Arabic, in Judeo-Arabic. Arabic language, Hebrew characters. Although, in the case of Maimonides, copies of his Guide of the Perplexed, in Arabic, Dalal al-Hairin, were found in Arabic characters as well. So Arabs definitely copied some of this material. In the case of Maimonides, a good deal of that material, of that book. The second element after this literary culture was the rabbinical culture, the religious theological culture. Much of the community has been deeply influenced, or better yet, taken over by elements from the Ashkenazi community. Now, these elements, in terms of religious values, are very, very different. The openness, intellectual, moral, existential, I would say, of our communities in the Middle East, North Africa, Spain, the Balkans, Europe, provided us with a very different way of viewing Judaism, which was much closer to the Muslim context that existed in the places that we lived. And that rabbinical culture gets involved, obviously, into people's lives. The way that legal decisions are made, the way that children are taught in schools, have a lot to do with how people behave and how their families are structured and how life goes on. So when I was growing up, I was taught in a very different way than my grandfather or great-grandfather might have been taught. So my values were very different. There was a sense of acculturation to America. And that acculturation was seen basically as Ashkenazi in affiliation. So that literary culture really fed into the rabbinical culture. The Ashkenazim do not really have a sense of a Judaism that has what we Americans would call secular culture in it. So within the medieval literary culture, you have poetry, you have scientific and mathematical writings, you have philosophy, all of which are not based on strictly Jewish sources. They're based on a much wider scope of reference for the person who is reading the material. So this literary culture and the rabbinical culture, once divorced from the more aesthetic elements of the culture, the food, the music, they go adrift in many ways. And what I had to do was acclimate myself within an academic environment to get those things back and bring them into the larger scheme of things. But again, they rub up against the different elements within the community. And it does become somewhat complicated because there are people who harbor elements of this literary and rabbinical culture, but do it in a very Ashkenazi sort of way. They've acculturated to Ashkenazi Judaism and have sort of superimposed that model on the older Judeo-Arab Sephardic model.
I mean, now there is much more discussion about Iraq and Iraqi Jews in the United States than there's ever been. Of course, we've had to have this war to bring it out, but in reality, most people recognize that I'm what is an Iraqi, and most people recognize there are such things as Iraqi Jews, something that before this horrible war was impossible. It was like it was almost like a joke. Even if you said it, people sort of went, ha ha ha, yeah. What a funny thing.
From which perspective it was a joke?
It was sort of an unbelievable, it was not a fact, it was an unbelievable story. If somebody to say, I am a Jew from Iraq, was almost like making a joke. It was so preposterous it was not a reality,
I will never forget, it was a rainy night, and we came to Lydda airport, and we were totally confused, feeling of almost being lost. We don't know what to do with ourselves, being uprooted. And it was raining and raining and raining. I will never forget that. It rarely rained in those days, but it rained when we came to Israel. And then we were asked to, obviously, to give information about ourselves. And there in the airport, our Arabic name was changed to Hebrew name based on the decision of the bureaucrats. While I decided it happened to many people who migrate from one country to another, and historically you can bring many references to show that, but it happened to me. And I became David Rabbi instead of Hikmat Rabi'a. And this was the first encounter that I realized that I'm in a different planet, different space and different time. And then it's an episode that repeats itself among Iraqi Jews. They placed the DDT on us because their assumption was, and I'm not trying to make any value judgment, their assumption is that if we came from Arab country, we probably are not very clean, and there's a need to. On the other hand, maybe their regulation was such, since we are coming from a foreign country, they try to be sure that we don't carry certain diseases to the country. I mean, in my age and stage, I try to rationalize both ways, but it did not take the pain from me, because I was young enough not to understand exactly what's happening. But when I saw my parents in this situation, I was very, very hurt. But I didn't have time to be hurt too much, because they put us on lorries, like hundreds and hundreds of people who came there. And they sent us to a transitional camp near Haifa called Pardes Khana. And then it was another journey, because the conditions were extremely difficult. My mother was a very large woman, and she found it very difficult to put herself into the tent. They gave us many tents. And then the tents flew in the air when a storm began. And then I wrote in my book that the conditions were not really very good, and there are reasons for it, I guess. But I remember that one time an Iraqi child fell into the pit, which was dug by the British for their soldiers to cast their waste. And I will never forget the cry of the Iraqi woman and she was shouting in Arabic, "Salhabat Abraham and ضاعت وأنا عين وجه الله," which is more or less, my daughter Salha, the daughter of Abraham, Salha, is lost, and I don't have any choice but to see the face of Allah for help, because there is no one in this dark place to help. While nurses came and doctors came sporadically to check us, and basic things were supplied to us in this transitional camp. But I remember my father, unshaved, sitting on a temporary bed that we received, peeling oranges that we received, and angry, frustrated. And in one episode, there's a wonderful term in Aramaic. They say, "Me'igra rama lebira amikta," meaning from the highest roof to the lowest well. And this is what my father found himself. So as children, you know, we adjust and move on. But to see our parents suffering, this was incredible, incredible suffering for all of us. And one time he tried to end his life by putting gasoline on his face. And my mother saved him the last moment. So I'm not saying this was the situation of all the families who live there, but this was the family, maybe, in my case, in my family, because my father felt it very strongly. I see my father is wearing the sidara, going to the al-Barq wal-Barid, you know, to the post office of Iraq, being in charge of so many people in his office, walking with him to the Sarai, you know, to see the water of the Tigris, and all of a sudden to see my father this way. And ironically, Arab Jewish women, or Sephardic women, they were stronger than men. They were able to overcome so many things. And I attribute everything. My father was a wonderful man that I loved dearly, very noble, very educated, very serious. But my mother was the person who took the burden on herself. When I describe my mother, I would describe her like the black ladies from North Philadelphia who take care of so many children. I call them the Rock of Gibraltar, because if it wasn't for my mother and her strength and her stamina to survive, I think without any exception, all my brother will tell you, will become either members of the mafia or criminals today in Israel and the Middle East, because we needed to survive. But this moral, ethical code that our parents installed of us, I think kept both our dignity and sanity. So it was difficult.
The question is, did they do such a thing to European Jews coming to Palestine?
I don't think so. When you mention the DDT in Israel, at least in the formative years of Israel, there's more opening now too, for people to tell their stories and to reflect. It was usually either ignored, or people say that we exaggerate, and people say that maybe we are too sensitive, etc., etc. But I assume certain assumption which was made of us, about us, because of our Arab background, play also a part in maybe in this activity. Whatever the reason, I think many Iraqi Jews who went through this, they can tell you that it hurts deeply. And if there is something that I remember very vividly, it's not so much the rain, not the sand, not the difficulties we had in transitional camp, but the DDT. Maybe it was not done to all Iraqi Jews, but it was done to my family. And you know, and to see my parents, who were sheikhs and kings and head of family, to see them in their humiliation, this is too much for a teenager to take.
Orit Bashkin's article, published in Middle East Journal in autumn 2016, titled "Unholy Pilgrims in a New Diaspora, Iraqi Jewish Protests in Israel 1950 to 1959, is a good source to learn about the biases and humiliation faced by Jewish Arabs in Israel. In her article, Orit Bashkin writes, about the matter of spraying Jewish Arabs with the toxic DDT upon arrival in Israel and introduces Sami Michael's novel, Shavim Veshavim Yoter, which means people are equal, but some are more equal. In his novel, Sami Michael presents the Baghdadi Jewish protagonist who describes how his father responded to the DDT spraying upon arrival in Israel's airport. Michael's powerful narrative captures the father's trauma that David Rabi'a mentioned. The daunting fact is that one finds only 2 or 3 online references in English detailing or even just mentioning this trauma and humiliating act by the Zionist state, and nothing in Arabic.
The establishment of pro-German regime in Iraq in 1941 with the head Rashid Ali al-Golani, who from their perspective they saw their regime as counter argument against the support of the British of the Zionist effort in Palestine. I think mentioning the issue of Germany and Rashid Ali al-Golani is very important because, again, I'm consistent in my thought that the clash was between the Iraqi nationalism, which was supported by German larger strategic perspective in the Middle East, which stood against the British agenda in the Middle East, which include not only the rights of Arabs, but also the rights of the Jews of Palestine in those days. And I think the clash between these two forces, which were beyond the control of any Jew in Iraq, accentuated the tension and the problem of a minority living in a Muslim community. I would say that you have to put things in larger perspective. Faisal I, who was the founder of the Iraqi monarchy, he was quite developed very positive view about the protection of the Jews of Iraq. He even came to the synagogue and held the book of the Torah.
فقضية رئيسية صارت في ذاك الوقت، ولحسن الحظ صار التقليد بالقبول حسب ما ذكر لي مدير الكلية في ذاك الوقت، أنه سأل إيش قد تريدون تقبلون، قال رتبت الأسماء حسب المجموع، يقولون 120. هو كان مسيحي من عقرة، مرحوم فتح الله عقراوي، يقولون 120 أخلي خط تحت 120، الفوق الخط مقبول، تحت الخط ما له دور، بدون حساب ايش قد عربي، ايش قد كردي، ايش قد مسيحي، ايش قد يهودي. كانوا يهود كثيرين معنا بالدراسة، ولذلك صارت دراسة 7 سنين عندنا، دراسة عملي ونظري متنوع، يعني مستوى الدراسة كان مستوى عالي، ولذلك الزملاء اللي راحوا لإنجلترا كانوا يقبلون في كل مكان. سواء للدراسة أو للعمل بدون تمحيص، مجرد أنه من كلية الطبية العراقية لها سمعة طيبة جدا.
تناقشنا في السابق من خلال مجموعة تاريخ العراق حول موضوع معاملة اليهود وفيما إذا كان يسمح لهم بالدخول في الجامعات أو في الجيش، فأرجو إعطاء نبذة مختصرة عما كان يحدث في كلية الطب آنذاك.
لم يكن هناك قيد على قبول أي عراقي في أي دراسة على قدر ما أعرف إطلاقا، وبالذات بالكلية الطبية ما كان هناك تقييد مطلقا. كان هناك تقييد قبل هذا الإجراء مع المعدل والمجموع، أنه بموجب المعاهدات والشروط اللي وضعت على دخول العراق في عصبة الأمم أن يحافظ على حقوق الأقليات، ولذلك كان هناك عدد معين لنواب اليهود ونواب المسيحيين في مجلس النواب، وطلبوا أن يكون قبول الطلاب في الكليات منسجم مع هذه النسبة، لكن هذه النسبة كان يجري تجاوزها خصوصا بالكليات العلمية، واستمر تجاوزها. فكانوا اليهود يقبلون في كل مكان حتى في خدمة الاحتياط ويمنحون رتبة.
كيف نقيم حقوق الأقليات في العراق قبل اتفاقية وشروط عصبة الأمم؟ هل كان العراقيون يتحيزون ضد الأقليات قبل ذلك؟
لا، أنا أعتقد من اللي شفته من في المجتمع عموما أنه لم تكن هناك قيود إطلاقا، ليس بسبب الشروط التي وضعتها عصبة الأمم، لأن المجتمعات العربية والإسلامية التي عاش فيها اليهود قرون طويلة، سواء في العراق، في مصر، في إسبانيا، كان اليهود يتمتعون بامتيازات كبيرة. ليس اليهود فقط، المسيحيين أيضا. يعني من نقرأ التاريخ وخصوصا تاريخ الطب نجد كثير منهم من اليهود والمسيحيين كانوا أطباء، وقسم منهم كانوا أطباء للخلفاء والحكام، فما كان تقييد أبدا. كنا نروح نلعب ويا أولادهم وأولادهم يجون لبيوتنا، نفس الشيء. المجتمع كان مجتمع منسجم.
Next on the other Arabs.
When I came to Israel, I saw that these musicians were in a very bad position. Only few of them who became the team in Israeli broadcast lived well from music, but the other musicians had to find some other profession in order to live.
اسمي حبيبة قوجمان. انولدت ب 1927 العمارة. من عمري 6 سنين دخلت المدرسة الابتدائية وكملت، وبعدين رحت المدرسة المتوسطة وكلها دراسة رسمية حكومية. بعدين بالثانوية ما كان ثانوية بالمدينة اللي انولدت بها،